Thank you very much. I'd like to invite all the speakers up to the front for questions and answers. We have 10 minutes, according to my clock here. Wow, we have a long line already, so I'm going to get started. Obviously, a very interesting topic. Let's start with the first question.
Thank you. This is a very interesting topic. I wanted to ask about the research. In my work with low-income consumers, the perception of the value of a product is based on how long it can be saved in the household, or whether it's easily, wasted if it's not used. And so, have you considered the effect of these labels not on decisions to discard, but on decisions to purchase, based on a differential valuing of the product? In other words, a long-lasting product has a greater value than a product that you have to discard after a day.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And we, Norbert and I, and some others have thought a lot about this. So where should we be intercepting consumers? Should these be questions that we ask them in the grocery store when they're making food purchase decisions, or are these questions we should be asking consumers in the household when they already have an inventory, they have their stock in front of them, and they're trying to decide how to manage that food? We, mostly Norbert, has done more work at the point of purchase, and the results generally line up, but there are definitely some nuances when you ask these types of questions at the point of purchase, for the reasons you describe. So you're right, it is important to, but I think it...
Replacement decision rather than the first decision to discard after a label is evaluated, right? It's.
Yeah, I guess it comes to that, and Norbert will probably have some thoughts on this too. But I think it, yeah. So I think household food waste can happen in many different ways at many different stages. I don't know, and I think in this project we decided we wanted to focus on that, partly because we were framing this as the product was one day past its due date, and so it made sense to think about, what's that decision in the household, keep or toss, and how does the date label. But I think that's a very good...
I'll just make a few quick comments. One, we have seen, we've run these experiments looking at a shelf-stable product, spaghetti sauce versus deli meat, and the products on average had the same price, and so we didn't see that response. I will say the literature has not done a good job of looking at low-income households, and so I don't want to make that assumption. There is some work that suggests that low-income households are really, really careful and making super sharp decisions about trying to avoid waste, and that has long-term implications in terms of what products are brought into the home. And then there are others who have suggested that there could be some sort of mismanagement, and I don't want to go into those debates, but the bottom line is this is a place that I'm interested in, would love to know more about. So thank you for your question.
Wendy?
Hi, I'm Wendy Johnson, and I'm from Nestle. And I have a bit of a cautionary tale about some of the solutions for reducing waste regarding bringing produce from more affluent areas and taking them to low-income areas that are close to date. This has been a trend that has happened by a lot of large retailers, and it really is frowned upon in the community. So I think the whole way that we message around this, because I think it's very important that we get produce into those neighborhoods, is going to be very important. So.
If I may just make a quick comment on that. I will give one comment on what I've seen at Daily Table, and I would say I know exactly what you're talking about, and that can be a real issue. My impression of what's going on at Daily Table, my experience going there was that this was a community effort, and so it wasn't just someone who decided that was a large retailer and we're just going to, if you will, dump our products here. This was something that the community worked on. And actually, if you go to their site and if you talk to the folks there, they were being very careful to make sure to hire people who were from the community. They were also being very thoughtful that research could not be done there. So there were these guiding principles that led the way they did what they did. So exactly. So purposeful and community connection. Agreed.
I could concur. Having been there a couple of times myself, I can concur that there was great messaging down up front on that.
Over back to this side. Question.
I have a question for Steve. This is Lee Frame from George Washington University. Recently, 2 of our students actually came up with an app called Last Call for Food, and it's designed to help students with food insecurity and match them with restaurants that are throwing out food. And one of the big issues, obviously, is logistics. And with your technology, it seems like something that you could potentially integrate with an app to connect restaurants that have this food loss and turn it into not food loss. Is that something that you see happening in the future?
I've seen a lot of those apps. I'd love to talk about it with you on the side. I mentioned in my talk that if you start with a prevention focus, which is where we are, you can often in those facilities, restaurants, corporate dining facilities, universities, you can often create the portal, the means by which you then support downstream efforts for recovery and things like that. So, and that would encompass some of the things that you're talking about. So, let's talk on the side about some of those. I've seen a number of the apps. Again, our focus is on prevention, but we're all for efficient food recovery efforts, and to the extent that at our client sites that we can help them to, in the short term and the immediate term, to do the best possible things with the excess food that they have, we're all for it.
Thank you.
Next question over here.
Hi, Tom O'Donnell with US EPA. Brad, I have a question for you. Referring back to your one table that you did, you reported your survey of overall discards based on the control group and then the date and then the best by date. Can I take a simple takeaway from that? So the numbers varied from 18% discards if the best if used by date was shown versus the control group, I think, had a 28%. What I want to know is if I can take a general takeaway that would say that food date labeling may have the ability of reducing household food waste by 10%. Is it fair that I take that out of here, or is that too simplistic?
I think you could say that with a caveat that that particular date label was the biosensor plus the best if used by, and I think you're right, it was 18%, the other one was 27%, so 9% reduction. And I would say that is for this fairly specific context that I set the survey up, was that if these 15 products are 1 day past their due date, that 9% effect would be for that particular story. And that, that I feel like that's a very aggregate effect that we found, but that lines up pretty well with what others are finding.
I would just say in the work that we were doing, we found like with spaghetti sauce, Best Buy led to, I think, a 9 or 10% reduction compared to the control case. So again, it's not, and excuse me, that wasn't in the same condition of like 1 day past. That was sort of, if you just went into the store, what would you do? So.
That was a good question. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentations. Norbert, this is for you. I think when we talk about loss or sort of what's left in the fields, that we don't talk enough about the fact that we're really talking about a policy issue. And I don't think it matters what side of the aisle you're on, right? When we talk to like our Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, access to labor is sort of the number one issue. And I just wanted to see if you wanted to say anything about that. Because I think on the other side, you could say, well, it's lack of market access, but I don't think that's what we're seeing.
So I'm so glad you asked that. Thank you, Becca, because at least with these fruits and vegetables, really delicate products, labor was a hugely important issue. And the challenge of accessing labor, because you can imagine when it's time to harvest, it's time to harvest. And so you've got to bring in the folks who can do that. And some of these areas are really struggling to make sure they had enough labor. And if the labor wasn't available or if the cost was too high, you're going to leave the product in the field. It's not worth getting it out. So being able to address the labor issue is significant. And there are communities that are really struggling to access labor, especially if you're talking about strawberries in California, where there are issues of housing pressures. Can you bring folks in where they're going to stay? And use of things like H-2A visas are complicated, and I mean, it's an important policy tool. It needs to be used, but it's not always flexible enough for folks. Folks at ERS have done some work on that, and some folks out of the University of Florida have been doing some work specifically on labor access issues. And so I think this is an important issue that needs further exploration. So thank you for your question.
Thanks for waiting patiently. 2 quick questions.
Right. Jean Halloran, Consumer Reports. I have a question about Seduxo and companies like that, because a lot of our food served in restaurants and institutions, comes from Seduxo and similar mass suppliers. And I saw they were on your list that you were working with. I was wondering what you were doing to help, or what can be done to help them reduce food waste, since it's sort of my impression that waste may occur, maybe significant waste occurs because institutional buyers are kind of buying in that kind of one-size-fits-all mass way.
Yeah, that's what we're all about. I mean, they're a key partner of ours, as well as Aramark and others in the food service space. That's what we're geared to do, right, to help them prevent food waste. Every kitchen has some level of food waste due to complexity, due to overproducing because no one wants to run out, due to various factors. So we're there every day working with those frontline workers and making those transactions visible. The first thing really we often talk about, you need to make that a safe environment, right? Because if you're talking about a chef community that is has been raised with the mantra, we don't waste food, right? And so it's accepted, and so you need to make it safe. So if you're coming in with a food waste prevention system, you're not bringing something to the fore that is intimidating and scary, right? You need to get past that, make it a safe discussion point, and then show the value, as I tried to do in that presentation, on just how much benefit there can be to reducing food waste, preventing it, reducing it in the immediate term, right? Because as we said, every kitchen's going to have it, right? And so as we put this process in place, you're going to be able to use alert features and things to see that, look for opportunities to turn that excess into something else so that you don't have to waste it. But more importantly, to change the operations and change the culture going forward to prevent the food waste from from recurring in the future. And that's what we're doing. It's effective, and as I think I showed, we can reduce typically food waste in operations like Seduxo's up to 50% on a site-by-site basis, and the cost reductions, anywhere from 2 to 8% are significant.
I think we're going to have to move on to the next session. Call Ronnie back up to start the last session. Thank you to the speakers for this session. Very interesting.